It is my hope that the title of today's sermon will intrigue you for at least a few moments this morning. Getting there with Abram and Sarai. For I have a hunch. Not only is their God our God, but their story is also our story. The wild God who calls them to leave home and family to follow Him into the unknown on nothing more than a promise is the very same wild God who calls us by name and invites us to follow Him into a future of promises we cannot imagine. This morning I called them Abram and Sarai, for there was a beginning, a time before their names were whispered reverently by God's people as Abraham and Sarah. For in the beginning they were two ordinary people living fairly ordinary lives. But everything changes when God calls and intrudes into their lives with a promise. A promise that has something for Abram and Sarai: descendants, a land, and a great nation. And something for all of humanity: a blessing. In the beginning, they are not Abraham and Sarah. They are Abram and Sarai, learning to trust this wild God who has called them to come and to collaborate with Him in making a wild dream into reality. If Abram's and Sarai's God is our God, and He commands that we have no other gods before Him, then I think it would be wise for us to acquaint ourselves with how this God works, who demands our sole allegiance. And if their story is our story, then we need to prepare ourselves for living with a God who often calls ordinary people beyond their ordinary lives to fulfill God's wild dreams. From the very beginning, the writer of Genesis sets us up. He sets us up by introducing us to a family, to someone named Terah, who is the father of Abram, Nahor, and Haran. There is tragedy in this family. Haran dies before his father and leaves a son, Lot. There is joy in this family. Abram takes a wife named Sarai. Nahor takes a wife named Milcah. Nahor and Milcah have sons, Milcah and Iscah. There is disappointment and sadness in this family. Abram's wife, Sarai, is barren. Her womb does not give life to sons or daughters. And for some reason, of which we are not told, there is a separation from family. Terah and Abram and Sarah and Lot leave the others in Ur to go to the land of Canaan. But for some reason of which we're not told, they don't get there. So they settle in Haran. Yes, we are being set up here. We have gotten to know this family, their names and their marriages, their joys and their sorrows, their dreams and their disappointments. We're being set up by a wild God who says to Abram, "Go from your country, your kindred, and your father's house to a land that I will show you." And right there at this moment, you and I begin to distance ourselves from this story of Abram and Sarai For we are connected to our families. We have celebrated births and we have grieved our deaths. We have found our place, put down our roots, lived our lives, forged our careers, started our families, raised our kids, and welcomed our grandchildren. If this God of Abraham and Sarai is our God, we become a little anxious. For what if He calls our names? What if He calls us to leave our fathers, our mothers, our sons and daughters, our relatives and friends, to go with Him, this wild God, to fulfill God's wild promises? Furthermore, Abraham and Sarah know this promise God is offering has one insurmountable problem. Sarah is barren. And this reality is going to become a real problem. Maybe not so much for God, but for Abram and Sarah, particularly as time passes and they grow older. Here at the very beginning, Abram is 75 and Sarai, I think, is about 65. And the biological clock is moving toward expiration. As they grow older and the wild dreams appears impossible to fulfill, they will attempt to take matters into their own hands. Sarai will give her servant girl Hagar to Abram. Hagar will give birth to a son whom will be named Ishmael. And at that moment, trouble begins in the family when Abram and Sarai attempt to take matters into their own hands. And so this becomes another place where you and I take exception with this story that is God's story, a wild God who intrudes into our ordinary lives. For you see, we are acutely aware. In some instances, we have become experts in knowing all of the obstacles, the hurdles, the challenges that God's wild dream for humanity will encounter. And we have concluded that God's wild dream cannot become a reality in this world in which we live. And so, like Abram and Sarai, we are tempted to take matters into our own hands. If God won't share the details with us, we'll take on the responsibility of filling in the blanks. If God won't tell us what's going to happen, we'll make the best of the mess God has pulled us into. So we will hold planning meetings and create vision statements and devise strategic plans and mount campaigns and buy property and hire employees and get something done in the name of God on our time and in our way. We do this because this wild God's ways are not our ways, and we cannot for the life of us imagine how this wild God will fulfill this wild dream for humanity. But most of all, we simply can't wait for Him. We can't seem to keep our faith with this wild God. Like Abram and Sarai, we laugh. How in heaven's name can this old man and this barren woman, 100 years old and 90, bring a child into the world? We laugh. It's impossible. For as our friend Grady Nutt used to say, never has anyone heard of a birth on the geriatric floor of the hospital. Never. Grady used to say that with a twinkle in his eye. Abraham and Sarai must come to grips with God's wild dream. In you, through you, all the families of the earth shall be blessed. And this is where we struggle too, I think. For many of us, it's hard to embrace the possibility that God may desire to do more with our lives than we are presently open to having Him do with us. It's often hard for us to accept that God plans to use us significantly, which means that our own ambitions must be compromised or jettisoned. It's hard for us to grasp ordinary people like Abraham and Sarai, that our lives, your life, my life, may be essential for the realization of God's wild dreams on this earth. Yet, it could be that those voices we hear deep down inside of ourselves late in the night or early in the morning, those voices that cry for our lives to have meaning, that cry for our lives to have purpose, for the lives that we're living on this earth to count something. These voices might be God's subtle calling to us to collaborate with Him in the fulfillment of His wild dreams for all humanity. And Abraham and Sarai, on this journey God invites them to take, they will find it quite difficult to trust only in Him and His promises. As they travel on this journey, they are not always sure that God is with them, that God goes before them, or even that God is preparing a way for them. So when they must go down in Egypt to survive the famine, they come up with their own creative way to survive in a strange land. Sarai is beautiful. So they will tell everyone that Sarai is not Abram's wife, but his sister. And here too, as we too try to make this journey, we too may find some comfort. For you see, our God has experience with people like us. People who are passionate today and unsure tomorrow. People who are promising faithfulness today and wrestling with fear tomorrow. People who desire to trust completely today, but tomorrow may be paralyzed by doubts. Yes, even here, the story of Abram and Sarai is our story too. With them we wrestle with this wild God. And we struggle to embrace His wild ways and to think His wild thoughts. Finally, our wild God confuses us a bit. For Abram's and Sarah's call is to a journey, not to a conquest or a campaign. I hope you noticed when you were listening to the second scripture lesson for today that when Abram and Sarai came to the land of Canaan, to Shechem, there were Canaanites living in the land. And Abraham and Sarai are called to live among and with and alongside these Canaanites. There is no quest mentioned here to throw them out, to take their land, to scatter them. All here in the beginning, the writer of Genesis says to us is that when they came there, Abram built an altar. At this point of the journey, Abram and Sarah will live among the Canaanites in this promised land. But they will choose to worship only this wild God who calls them to leave home and family and native land, who makes promises that appears impossible to keep, for Sarah's barren. Yet he declares that all families will be blessed through the hip. In recent days, our brother Francis has come among us, honoring God, not mounting a conquest in God's name. And this journey of our brother has inspired hundreds of thousands of Christians here in America during his visit with us. Our brother Francis, in the spirit of our God with wild dreams, Francis has challenged us to respect the dignity of every human being. He encourages us to make room and to become tolerant for the diversity of our human family. He calls us to respond to people compassionately, withholding judgment. He remembers that our wild God has an open heart and hand to the poor. So, in honoring our God, He gracefully declines lunch with men and women of power to eat with the poor and the homeless in Washington, D.C. Our brother Francis understands quite clearly that love is not a conquest. We are called to love our enemies, to do good, to bless, and to pray. We are to be merciful as our wild God is merciful. This morning, I wonder if it's possible that we will ever find our way to stand alongside and with Abram and Sarai. Can we, just for a few minutes, consider that this wild God may ask us to leave behind our families and what is familiar to us? This wild God may call us to collaborate with Him in fulfilling a dream, one of His wild dreams for the blessing of all peoples on earth. Can we imagine for just a little while that this wild God might have some plan for us, some significant movement in our lives that eclipses everything that we've done till this moment, and yet we cannot see it at all? Can we contemplate that God may have a way of dealing with all the obstacles and the hurdles, the doubts and the fears that paralyze here today, that keep us from going with Him? With Abraham and Sarai, regardless of our age, hear that, whether you are old or young or in between, regardless of our experiences, how long you've been on this journey or how short your time may have been, can we open our hearts and our minds to the possibility of God calling us into His wild dreams? And if we dare to hear that call, do we dare go with our God? Can we risk losing our present lives for the sake of a richer and deeper life in which we become instruments in the hands of God for the blessing of all humanity, for fulfilling God's promises, for making God's wild dreams a reality? Somehow, Abram and Sarai got there, will we be able to get there? But let us remember today that getting there is a journey. And you may not even have to leave this room or leave this pew for this journey to begin with you. It may be a journey that begins with a change of perspective. Change of perspective in which you see yourselves and your world in a new light. In a little while, a wonderful young woman named Anika Rogers is going to be here with our Women's Jubilee to share about thistle farms in Nashville and how women whose lives have been locked in prostitution and addiction and human trafficking are found and set free through a love that heals. It's a story we all need to hear. And sometime all of us who are men here need to find a way to hide and listen this afternoon too. But here is where the journey began for a young woman who made her way to thistle farms. And this is how a journey to go with God and be with God, to fulfill God's dreams, may begin with us. More than leaving, it may be like coming home. This woman writes, I remember the first day I came home. There were 4 beautiful women walking out to the porch to say hello. I looked at the gated yard and had the strange feeling that it seemed familiar. I realized that I had lost my way long ago, and coming into this place gave me an almost forgotten sense of peace. When I walked in, there were plants everywhere, and I was crying because there was nice furniture. I loved the soft bed that felt completely different from the prison mattress I had just left. When I went into the kitchen, I rejoiced at the pots and pans because I remembered the glass jars and spoons I had left on the sidewalk. This was the home I'd almost forgotten. Thank God for leading me home. Thank God for leading me home. This journey to be with Abraham and Sarai, with a wild God with wild dreams, may lead us not only to a far country, but to a far country that we discover is home. Can we get there with Abram and Sarai?